All right, so now we can create a trip and view all of our trips. But if we click on a trip, we don't see anything. That's because we don't have anything created. So now let's go ahead and make it so that if we click on a trip, we can see more details about that trip. So let's open up our code. And the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new view. So we go into our trip app views.py file. We'll come on down to the bottom of the file. And we can create another class-based view. This time we'll call it trip detail view. And it will inherit from detail view, which we have to import up here. So next to template view and create view, import detail view. And if we hover over it to get some details, render a detail view of an object, which is exactly what we're trying to do. So we can come back down to this class here. And really all we have to specify is the model. So we could say model equals trip. Now there's one other thing we want to update for this class, and that's because right now we would just get the data stored on trip. So if we looked in our models.py, we would just get this data. We wouldn't know anything about these notes. So we want to go back into our views and update the context variable that gets passed in to also have the notes data. And we can do that by overriding a method. So we could say def get context data and take self and keyword args. And then the very first thing we're going to want to do is just get the actual context. So get the actual trip itself. So context equals, and then we'll just call super.get context data, passing in the keyword args. So this will get that current trip. And now we want to add to this context the notes. So we want to say trip equals context, and by default it gets called an object on the context. So now we have that actual trip, and then we can grab the notes from this trip equals trip.notes.all, and we're able to say do this trip.notes because in our models.py on our note model where we store the trip, we set this related name equal to notes. So that means from a trip we can say notes.all or .filter, and it will give us the notes that are only associated with that trip. So we want all of them. And then we can add this onto this context dictionary. We could say notes equals notes, and then we just return the context. And now we'll have access to this new context variable in our template, and it will have the object, which will be the trip, and it will have notes, which will be all of the notes associated with that object, with that trip. Now let's wire up our URL so that it fires that view. So we can go ahead and just duplicate this previous one, and we want this to be dashboard trip, and then we will specify here an integer, and it will be the PK, the primary key, or the ID, same thing of the trip itself, so that we know which specific trip instance we want. And we don't want trip create view, we want trip detail view. So again, we have to import that from the view. And then instead of the name being trip create, let's call it trip detail. Awesome. And so the last thing to do is to create a template. And by default, it will want it to be called model_detail.html. So if we come into our templates, trip, new file, trip_detail.html. And this naming convention is because we used that class-based view that used the detail view. And then I'm going to paste in this markup right here. And then I'm going to paste in this markup right here. So this HTML. And again, it will be linked below, or it will be in the repo. We're extending the base. We have a title here, the trip details. Then we have some of the trip details itself, like the country and the city. And then we list out all of the notes. So for note in notes, and we have the note image, the note name. We don't have any notes right now, but we will create some later. So that's all for the trip detail. So make sure your server is running. And the last thing we want to do before we check that out is update our trip list.html so that we can add a link for each trip that links to its detail page. So inside of this div, we can just wrap everything in an A tag, and this will go to URL trip detail, and we pass in trip.pk so that it has the ID. Take this closing A tag and move it all the way down below this paragraph, like so. And then we can just indent this so it's a bit more formatted. Save that. Make sure your server's still running. And if we open up this in a browser and we click refresh on the dashboard, now we can click on one of these and be taken to its detail page. So we see the country and the city, and then we see all of the notes and the possibility to add a new note. Now, right now we don't have any notes, so we don't see anything, but we will create some so that we can see those in the future. In the next video, we're going to have it so that we can actually view details for a note, and then we will also create some notes so they will be showing up here as well. But this is coming along nicely. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.